powerful is faith? What can faith accomplish? Well, in the lesson that we're going to look at today, we're going to see faith that's so powerful, it's able to take on an entire army. Genesis 14 is one of the more interesting chapters, really, in the entire book of Genesis. After all, for 2 chapters, we've been reading along about this guy Abraham and his nephew Lot and everything that's happening. And then all of a sudden, seemingly out of the blue, we get a very long catalog of dead kings and wars and vassals and all kinds of stuff that might seem confusing to us. As we study this chapter, though, it becomes clear that what's going on here is a battle that's going to end up impacting Abraham because it impacts Lot, who has now chosen to live in Sodom. Hebrews 11:34 says that through faith, heroes of the Old Testament chased entire armies, and no doubt this story is at least one of the ones that he has in mind. Now, this chapter serves several different purposes, and it's helpful to ask at the beginning, why do you think God would include a story like this? And perhaps even have your group read through and give reasons. Why do you think God included this story? It's a little bit perhaps unfair to whoever gets to read some of those verses with all of the names in it, but just do the best that you can. And I would say have your group read through the story and ask them, why do you think God included this seemingly strange tale? Now, the background is the first 12 verses. And again, we've talked before in these training videos about how with small groups, the goal really is to do as little talking as possible and to get to the questions and to bring other people in and incorporate them. And I tried real hard to think of good discussion questions about the first 12 verses, and I wasn't really able to. And so there's one question on that first point. I think this is just one of those places where it's inevitable. You're going to have to give some explanation. And what you're hopefully doing is setting the table a little bit to help people understand what's going on here and why all of these details are being included. Typically, when the Bible gives lots and lots of details about something, that's because what they're talking about is very, very important. And so we see here that there is faith that fights an army, and so it begins with this background. And essentially what's going on is that you have the 5 kings in Canaan against 4 kings in Mesopotamia. Now, it's helpful to understand a little bit of the historical, cultural background to this chapter. And it works something like this. In ancient times, there were lots of city-states. And so you would have countries, but countries were kind of more an alliance, a grouping together of these city-states that would have kings. And especially at this point, you'd have this city with its king, and you'd have this city with its king. Now, that's a little bit different from what we're used to when we think of, for example, the King of England, who's the king of a country, or the King of France, who's the king of a country. But during this time, you'd often have cities that would have kings, and they would band together. And you would sometimes have these really strong, powerful cities that would form these giant nations like Egypt or like Assyria or Babylon. And then kind of on the fringes of those nations, there would be smaller city-states. And those smaller city-states were kind of like the little guys that got batted around. And oftentimes they would be serving one lord. They would be what would be called a vassal that would be following after Assyria or Babylon or the Hittites or some of these different world powers. And so they would pay them money for protection. And it kind of worked like the mafia, right? Everybody paid the mafia for protection. And if you ask the mafia, wait, is that protection from other people or protection from you? They would just kind of smile and say, exactly, protection. And that's kind of what's going on here, okay? So oftentimes they would be, these vassal states would pay these bigger countries to protect them. And sometimes the bigger countries would show up and say, we're going to protect you. We would like you to pay us now. And that was just kind of understood. Now, if you're one of the smaller nations, you don't really want to be paying lots and lots of money to other countries if you can help it. And so there was this delicate game that had to be played, and that was, do we pay or do we not pay? And if you read the rest of the Old Testament, particularly the history of Israel, you're going to see this happen a lot, particularly for Israel in the north as they come near the end of their time, right before Assyria comes in and invades them. There's a back and forth, Assyria, Egypt, Something similar will happen with Babylon and Judah in the south, where Babylon will come and Israel will be their vassal, and then they'll try and get Egypt to come and be their protector. And so a lot of times these smaller nations are trying to play this game where they pit one superpower against another, or they think, you know what, I think Babylon's pretty weak right now. I think Assyria's pretty weak right now. We're just not going to pay them, and we're going to see what happens. Or we're going to send their payment to Egypt, and we're going to see what happens. And so, again, that's kind of some of the background. And what we find here in Genesis 14 is that there are all of these little city-states in Canaan that have to pay money to a king named Kedorlaomer. I think that's how you'd pronounce it, Kedorlaomer. And Kedorlaomer is a big, powerful, important king, and he has a strong military, and so all of these kings down in Mesopotamia are sending annual tribute to him. And then one year they decide, you know what, I don't think we're going to do that. 5 of them get together and basically tell Kedorlaomer, who's living in Mesopotamia, which is where later we're going to have Babylon and the Medo-Persian Empire are going to arise out of Mesopotamia, in this general area of the world where there's a lot of power. And so he's a powerful king in this area. And the kings in Canaan decide, listen, buddy, we're not gonna pay you anymore. Well, you can't just let little nations, city-states stand up to you like that, because if they do and they get away with it, then no one's going to pay you. And so Kedorlaomer comes down with his troops, and he defeats them. He annihilates them. And the important detail for our story really begins in verse 12 at the very end. It says, and they took Lot, Abram's brother's son, okay, so that's brother, son, nephew, who dwelt in Sodom. Okay, he's living in the city. He's gone from being a wandering nomad to having a house, living in the city of Sodom. And it didn't really go super well for him. Lot has apparently been wanting success, and so he's cashed in on what Sodom has to offer. And too often, Christians today will look to the world and they'll start following it, hoping that they can find the success, only to find out that the world's problems become their problems. Lot joined Sodom thinking, well, hopefully this will go better for me. And Sodom gets into all kinds of trouble, and now Sodom's trouble is Lot's trouble. And you would hope that Sodom would learn, or that Lot would learn from this. Maybe I shouldn't be hanging out in Sodom. Bad things are happening. But he does not, and of course, that's another story for a later time. And this brings us to Abram. Now, I've spent a decent amount of time with that background. I would say when you're teaching the lesson, get through that material as quickly as possible. And this brings up another point. Don't feel like you have to cover each point evenly. If there's something that doesn't seem to resonate with you as well, feel free to go through it quickly and then move on to something that you are more excited to talk about. With something like this, the background is necessary. We have to have the background. However, there's not really a lot of time for discussion, so don't take 20 minutes going into the background and the history and what's going on and the different kings and where we think they might have been. Just kind of briefly set the table and then get to really the tests of faith that Abram faces. And as we look at this, I think it's interesting that Abram really faces 2 tests of faith. The first test of faith is whether or not he's going to stand up to these kings, whether he has faith to fight an army. It says in verse 13, and there came one that had escaped, and told Abram the Hebrew, for he dwelt in the plain of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol, the brother of Aner, and these were confederate with Abram. These guys were hanging out with Abram. They were friends with Abram. And so somebody comes and tells Abram what had happened. And we see that Abram demonstrates courage. He demonstrates courage by knowing all of these obstacles and going to fight anyway. Fear looks at the obstacles. Faith looks at what needs to be done and trusts God for the right outcome, to push past the obstacles. Fear says, I can't. Faith says, I can't, but God can. The same faith that led Abram to leave behind Ur and Haran has now led Abram to give Lot the first choice, is now leading him to go a step further and to take on an entire army. And I think this is interesting. Secondly, it says that Abram's faith inspired others. We see here in verse 14 that Abram heard this, that his brother, or brother there could mean nephew, that's the relation, the Hebrew word could mean brother or nephew, that when his brother was taken captive, he armed his trained servants, born in his own house, 318, and pursued them unto Dan. Now this is interesting, 318 plus Abram, that's 319, plus, as we're going to find out later, Abram's friends, Anar, Eshcol, and Mamre. You say, I don't see that here. Well, it becomes clear later in verse 24, the last verse. Abram tells Sodom, hey, look, I don't want any of your stuff. I'm not going to take any of it, save only that which the young men have eaten, right? My soldiers that are with me have eaten some of the food, and the portion of the men that went with me. So Lot says, look, I'm not going to take my stuff. My soldiers, they can get some spoil of war as payment for what they did. But then he says, the men that went with me, and then he specifies Anar, Eshcol, and Mamre, who likely also had servants who were with them. But the point is that this group, Abram and his servants and these three friends of his and probably their servants as well, they all go and attack this king, this confederate of kings, that as we read has just been stomping everybody in their way. This is a bold move. This is a pretty confident move. And you may say, well, the 318, they were Abram's servants. They were Abram's servants, but if they felt like it was a suicide mission, they could have said, listen, we're not going. We're not doing it. There's 318 of us and there's one of you. But they didn't do that. They followed him. Not only that, but these three men that were in confederacy with Abram, after hearing about these kings just wiping out entire city-states and armies, said, yeah, we'll go with you. We'll fight them. There's something about Abram's faith that is apparently inspiring to those around him, and our faith likewise can be inspiring to others around us. We've talked in previous lessons about how a lack of faith is going to have a detrimental impact on the people around you, but the opposite is true as well. If you show faith, that can make a difference in the lives of people. And so Abram's faith inspired others, and then finally we see here that we've got two more. Abram's faith demonstrated wisdom. Abram didn't just go running, screaming at this army and saying, get over here, we're going to get you. His plan has actually got some solid military strategy. All that to say, faith doesn't have to be equivalent with stupid. Sometimes faith will require choices that the world looks at as stupid, but faith doesn't negate the need for wisdom. Abram's attack here is clever. He divides himself against them. He goes in by night, he smites them, and then he pursues them. And so he divides his troops up to hit them from both sides. He hits them at night when they're not expecting it, and he wins. Abram's faith was successful. He routed an entire army. Actually, if you want to think about it, he routed 4 armies, a confederation of armies. And again, similarly for us, we probably not going to see 4 armies fleeing before us. I don't think that'll happen to me. Maybe it'll happen to you. But God can do, and God does do, incredible things through the faith of his people. And I think it's worth thinking about examples of people who've shown great faith, who've seen God's blessing, whether they be historical examples, whether they be biblical examples, or even whether they be personal examples. Times when you stepped out and said, I'm going to trust God, and just every step of the way, he led and guided and directed, and we ended up accomplishing way more, or we ended up seeing far more fruit in this than we ever thought that we would. Now we have Abram's second test of faith. The first test of faith is perhaps the most obvious one. Is he going to trust God to help him take on an entire army? But it's not the only one. So we have this last section here where Abram meets with Melchizedek and then with the leader of the king of Sodom. And you might not think of this as a test of faith. It doesn't really come across as a test of faith, but in reality, that's what it is. And the test of faith here is, will he have the humility to continue trusting God? Or will he be ruined by success? There are many times where people have been ruined by success. The old expression, to the victor goes the spoil, means that people are often victorious and think that they can demand what they want, that they're in charge, that they've earned it. And yet that's not the attitude of Abram. Abram comes in with humility, and he trusts God. So we see, first of all, Abram and Melchizedek. Melchizedek is a king in Jerusalem. Now this is one where it gets really interesting, and there's a lot that has been said, and books have been written, and Jews during the Second Temple period or the intertestamental period were having all kinds of writings about who is Melchizedek, and there's all kinds of debates and all of this mystery and who exactly is he. Some people say he's a pre-incarnate Christ. Some people say he's some kind of angelic being. I'm going to go the simple route. I'm going to say Melchizedek is exactly who Genesis says that he is. Okay, it's kind of a novel approach. Not necessarily other people have held it. But who is Melchizedek? Well, he is the king of Sodom, he is the king of Salem, and he is the priest of the Most High God. I think Melchizedek was an actual human person, normal human, who was the king of Salem, later Jerusalem. Okay, Salem means peace. He was priest of the Most High God. He was a king who was also the priest. Now that raises all kinds of questions. Why was he a king and a priest? Right? Because later on, you're not supposed to combine those two. And in fact, I think that's part of the reason that Psalm 110 is so important for the New Testament, because Psalm 110 connects being a king with being a priest and says that the coming king will be the priest after the order of Melchizedek. Now, if you're a Levitical priest, you can't be a king because you have to be from Judah to be a king. But it doesn't say in Psalm 110, and I'm getting a little bit off field, I realize that, but in Psalm 110, read it carefully. It doesn't say that the king, the Lord of David, the Lord said to my Lord, sit here until I make your enemies a footstool. That Lord, he's not going to be a Levitical priest. He's going to be a Melchizedekian priest. That's different. He's going to be a king priest. And so as we read this passage, it's curious that we have a king who's a priest. And Psalm 110 picks up on that as it predicts the Messiah. And then the author of Hebrews makes a big deal of that when he says Jesus wasn't from the Levitical priesthood, he was from the Melchizedekian priesthood, which means there's a new law, it means there's a new covenant, everything has been replaced, and all of that really was predicted in Psalm 110 when we read that there's a new priesthood coming. Okay? Now that's a lot of extra, you don't have to get into all of that, but when we think about this guy Melchizedek, the question often comes up, who do you think Melchizedek was? I think he was a man. The toughest part about that is that in Hebrews it says that he was without father and without mother. And I think what he means by that is simply that there's no genealogy. Melchizedek just shows up out of nowhere and then disappears. We don't know who he is. We don't know where he came from. We have no idea why it is that a king in the city of Jerusalem or Salem is the priest of God. Who set that up? How did that happen? There's so much that we don't know. It creates curiosity, and it also can create speculation. And I think that sometimes there's been too much speculation about this passage. I think that what this passage says is what it means. Melchizedek is the king of Salem, and he's the priest of the Most High God. And so as Abram comes and meets him, we see that Abram responds with humility. It says that he, that's Melchizedek, blessed him, that's Abram, and said, blessed be Abram of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be the Most High God, which hath delivered thine enemies into thine hand. And he, this is Abram now, gave him, that's Melchizedek, tithes of all. So Abram takes the spoils and gives tithes to the priest, to Melchizedek. And both of these actions, both receiving the blessing from Melchizedek and then paying tithes to Melchizedek, speaks to Abram's humility. Once again, if we go back to Hebrews, we're going to find out that the author of Hebrews says that the lesser is always blessed by the greater. Now that may seem strange, but that's what we see in Scripture, that the Father blesses the Son, and when he blesses him, it's almost prophetic. The Son doesn't bless the Father. That's opposite of the way that's supposed to work. The greater blesses the lesser. If you pronounce a blessing on someone, that's almost taking a position of superiority over them, and Abram accepts that willingly from Melchizedek. Then, of course, he pays tithes to Melchizedek. And all of this is showing that Abram hasn't been corrupted by his victory. He doesn't view himself as somehow better. He shows proper humility and deference to God's priest, recognizing that the victory ultimately came from God and showing honor to the priest as a result. And then we see Abram's response to the king of Sodom. The king of Sodom said unto Abram, give me the persons and take the goods to thyself. And Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have lift up mine hand unto the Lord to make a vow or a pledge, the Most High God, the possessor of heaven and earth, that I will not take from a thread even to a shoe latchet, and that I will not take anything that is thine, lest thou shouldest say, I have made Abram rich. Now we don't know, but it is interesting to speculate that perhaps some of this is a response to what happened in Egypt. Abram went into Egypt, took a bunch of stuff, and then ended up being pretty humiliated as he got chased out. Whether that's the case or not, we see Abram here who's come to the conclusion, I don't want to take stuff from Sodom because I want to take a stand and show that I am following God and God alone. And so we see Abram passing both tests. Both the test of, are you going to fight an entire army? And also the test of, are you going to show humility when you're victorious? Abram is a great example of faith. And the God of Abraham is the God that we follow today. God can give us great victories. And like Abram, we too need to be reminded and we need to be careful that when God brings those victories our way, that we are very cautious to remember that it's God that did that, and to continue to stay humble and to remember what it is that he has done and to give him the credit and him the glory and to show ourselves as being faithful to him. And through that, you and I, through a life of faith, can see great victories, great successes, and who knows, maybe even one day put an entire army to flight.